begin?
Sure.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with Danny, and you must wonder why. I'm glad you asked to tell you. So Danny Stratton was realized as somebody who's a creator. He's a writer. He's an editor. He worked on market for years, but he's also a historian and biographer. So he's a scholar of the field. So you can has both the insider view. Right. Well, that was what I'm saying. It's a choice. But so I wanted to start with you that if you could walk us through, first of all, just how it all got started, because you're the historian, but also from your own perspective, somebody who edited Spider-Man for years and wrote comics for decades, how you saw comics role in this one.
Well, let me evade your question entirely by showing the world's smallest PowerPoint presentation. I found some of just up to the titles of some of these DC Comics public service publications. I will get to it. Justice for All includes children. Buzzing scores 1 for the handicapped. Superman says human rights for all. Superboy says know your community. Buzzing says old people are folks too. Superman says the world is our classroom, is our schoolroom, and then just people are people without any superhero endorsement. So comics really have been battling against for a long time.
And tooth decay. That was not alien science, right? Yes. The most important evil of all. Tooth decay.
You know, it's not what you say. It's not true. It's not untrue. Well, look, history of comics, and Roy has studied and researched and written about as much as anybody. Starts with the Superman, who was a kind of, and we looked at as a metaphor for immigrants, for someone escaping persecution, as a metaphor for the warnings of the Holocaust. Batman too, and I wrote a little book about it, and did other people. I think the comics were the best of America, the best of how we wanted to see ourselves as welcoming and fair-minded, and sort of. I'm not sure how in depth the history needs to go.
But there's the punch that was heard around the world.
Right, the Captain America punching Hitler. Right?
2 Jews from one from the Lower East Side and one from Syracuse, New York, who didn't like that we weren't battling the Nazis.
Nor did Norman Goodman. The publisher of that good.
Yes.
Have you guys heard of Jack Kirby, or is this like a vague name for you? Okay.
Well, it can't hurt for anyone who hasn't.
Yeah, it can't hurt for anyone who hasn't. So Jack Kirby was raised on the Lower East Side, and so he was part of like gangs. I mean, what was his gang? His street gang.
The Yancey Street.
He was. I think So he grew up as kind of a scrappy kid, but back then, Jewish artists couldn't get hired in the advertising industry, which is where most of the artists went. And so they were kind of relegated to that dirty little, like, backdoor thing called comic books. And Joe was the, worked for the newspapers in Syracuse, right? He was a news reporter.
Yeah, sports reporter.
Sports reporter, but he also drew and wrote. And then Jack and Joe decided, like, the Nazis, why aren't we battling Nazis? And this is a year before Pearl Harbor. They put out Captain America, which famously had the cover of Captain America punching Hitler. He never punches Hitler in the entire comic interior, but on cover he punches him. And it was a whole year before Pearl Harbor and before we got into the war. So, he was sending a message to Roosevelt that we should step up.
Because they got death threats for it, right? It was a true act of bravery.
They got what? They got death threats. Yeah,
they got death threats. In fact, there was one call. Somebody called. It would have been Timely back then. Timely Comics, and said, "Are you the guy? I'll meet you on any street corner." And so Jack Kirby said, "Sure," and started to run down to the street corner.
See, there was a time before the internet where if you wanted to threaten somebody, you had to call.
And meet him on the street corner. Yeah.
And then the Bailey Guardia sent up a special detail of cops to protect them. Yeah, comics. By the way, just talking about the Jack and Joe. If you've seen The Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan movie, and there was some criticism about how Pete Seeger's wife, what attention that it didn't get during the Mad. I figured out that she went to high school with all the Mad magazine guys. That they were the same. So it's a New York melting pot. We had Coachy Seaver and John Severin, now Jack and Louis Elder, all in high school. I mean, I can only imagine who else was in that class, but it's a real melting pot story above and beyond just the Bob Dylan vibe. But yeah, comics. Even I'd say some of the unfortunate caricatures, ethnic and racial in comics. I don't think those are done out of hate. I think that's a weird, really inclusion. Doesn't look so good now, those characters.
No, certainly the original Captain America run. Remember all the yellow perils?
Yes.
I mean, that's
Well, that was yes,
was racist.
that wasn't Good point. Those comics with hate for a purpose.
I'm sorry. Yellow what?
The yellow peril, which was kind of the racism towards the technical guy.
Yeah. And
But then if you want to talk about plain old comic industry, and also to bring more people into discussion, it was, a milestone. And that was like a moment. Because when I started at Marvel, for one thing, there weren't very many women. There was Louise Simonson, Marie Severin, Joe Duffy, and Miss It was like basically mostly all white male company. DC was too.
Was there a female romance editor at DC?
Maybe. Karen Berger was over it when I got into business. Karen was already in the business over at DC. But then Milestone said, started their own company. Like, why didn't the women do that? Why didn't we start our own company?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. From my point of view, it was Vertigo that basically it was Jeanette Kahn as the president and publisher of DC Comics. Jeanette Kahn was dangerously intelligent, very socially aware, and so under her time, she saw the world and she made intentional moves to expand that. Karen was part of the superhero universe. She edited Wonder Woman. And Jeanette Kahn and Paul Levitz, Paul and Karen were friends, and they knew each other, I think, back from shopping at Flatbush Comics and Cards in Brooklyn. And that was really the beginning of Vertigo. And Vertigo challenged what we thought American comics could do. It was more akin to heavy metal and mature content. And it very cleverly used the superhero genre to address mature themes. And then one night you went to bed and one day you woke up and there were no more superheroes in Vertigo. And then Vertigo was all creator owned and it went right for the jugular with things like Enigma. And Preacher and things like that. So in my mind, Vertigo was kind of like the temple of women editors bringing, that kind of maturity and sensibility to comics.
And the British invasion. She brought all the Brits over.
Exactly. That was Jeanette Kahn and Karen Berger and saying,
Greg Morrison,
go find these voices. Bring them.
So one of the things I can say, I started out at Vertigo before it was officially Vertigo. And at that point, I when I interviewed, I just said, I wrote Tara. And they said, oh, you should go be with Karen Berger. She does the weird stuff. And I think that what was interesting about what she was looking for, so Karen didn't really have background in comics. Like a lot of us grew up loving comics. Karen just loved stories. And Paul Levitz once said about Karen that all of her stories tended to be about a world behind the world that you see. That there is something going on, behind the surface. So you had, the superhero stories or not superhero stories. There was a whole group of mainly British writers in the beginning who were very political. And they wanted to subvert what was going on. It was this moment where Margaret Thatcher had risen to power, and her stance was reminiscent of stuff we see today. This very anti-immigrant, if you're poor, it's because you're not industrious enough. And if you're rich, it's because you're worthy. And we should reward the worthy and punish the not industrious. And so they were countering all of this in their narrative. And she also obviously encouraged people who were themselves not necessarily white men, if they were interested and had stories to tell.
Yeah, that's right. So that's how so to me, like, that's where the women and their editorial influence and story influence came in. About 30 blocks away at the time was Milestone, which launched in 1993. Milestone was founded by Dwayne McDuffie, Dennis Cowan, Michael Davis, Derek T. Dingle, and the fifth Beatle was Christopher Priest. Christopher Priest would, I think, be the youngest editor at Marvel to edit Spider-Man, I think, between the ages of 19 and 21.
I have to say that that's true, since I was his assistant editor at the time.
There you go.
We were the first black editor, all black editorial team.
Yeah, Priest was the first mainstream black editor at Marvel and DC.
What is this?
Marvel? Yeah, that was the early 80s. So when he was at Marvel, and then he moved over to DC and basically handled the Archie line under the brand Impact. But he was working as a DC editor at day, and at night, he was staying at the DC offices, and he was co-creating Milestone. Right? So he was moonlighting, like co-creating Milestone. And so the first books came out in 93, and Milestone was a response to, to point out what you said, Danny, about American comics. American comics were a reflection of America, right? And America is, down to its DNA, designed with and full of inequities, right? Racial inequity, gender inequity, inequity of people who are not Caucasian heterosexual males with all working limbs. Anything that is the other, Milestone took that on. And it represented accurately people from different ethnic backgrounds, people from different sexual orientations. It showed that no one category of people was monolithic. It was the first well-rounded representation of Black life in America. It was the first time I ever saw Latino superheroes that spoke Spanish, and there were no footnotes letting you know what they were saying. So it was like real life. If you don't know Spanish, then you're like, I don't know, in like East Harlem, and there's a conversation going on you're not going to get it, right? That separation is part of real life. And that was reflected in the books. And so that's where I started my career in those 90s, which were really fueled by the revolutionary things that Marvel did in the 60s. Not just the creation of these characters, but Marvel took on drugs in the 60s, just like DC did. Marvel did it with Spider-Man. DC did it with Green Lantern and Green Arrow. When you came into the 80s, you had DC Comics, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, using their three main characters, right? Using Superman to talk about toxic wealth and narcissism through the reinterpretation of Lex Luthor. You have Wonder Woman. The origin of the Amazons was re-envisioned so that the Amazons were reincarnations of women who were murdered due to injustice and violence since the beginning of time. You had Batman, right, which really did a deeper examination of the realities of urban life, right? Why is there squalor right next to wealth? Are the police pristine, or is there corruption within the police department? How do the different layers of government work? right? Do you see them make that shift in the 80s? And that kind of laid the groundwork, the maturity of content for what Milestone would then move forward with in a more expansive even in the 80s.
On a much more 80 cents kind of level in the 60s, Stan Lee started telling his artists and colorists, put a black person in the background. Never mind whether they're black or It was New York City. They should have people of different colors. It was a primitive step, but to get an idea of where the medium and the country was at. Stan wrote an editorial against prejudice, and that was considered a daring step. It was like, we don't approve of him. Oh, how dare! Whoa, what a controversial step, but it was a big thing.
Can I say, so it's interesting. So I was working at DC in the 90s, and I remember being taught that if, the writer was white and the artist was white, and you didn't specify that there should just be people of color in the background, all the faces would be white. And it seems like such a small thing, but, I grew up in New York City, and you look at Friends, and I'm trying to think of other 90s sitcoms, 90s, and it's not just that the main characters are white, it's a white world.
But even to this day, I was working on a script yesterday, and I put in, how about Spanish? This is Spanish, but this is mixed race. This is, because if you don't, a lot of times you'll just get along white people back. Like even if you don't specify to the artist will in general draw white people, because who knows if that's just prejudice, thinking that's what they want. So that still goes on, that you have to specify that this is New York, it's going to be a mixed race.
Yeah, that's true. To this day, I think I'm the only artist who's ever just randomly thrown a little person pulling a suitcase through an airplane. Because I wanted to. I do a lot of documentary listening when I work. And oftentimes a lot of that filters out. As an artist, as writers, we start to the gut that comes out of our fingertips. So if you're part of an environment, even if it's a superficial one that's on the Netflix, it's special, it'll come through eventually. So I have always been cognizant of putting everybody I can think of. So I've had fans everywhere. And they eventually are going to come through. I was watching a documentary about East Ethiopia, what was happening over there. And as I was doing Superman, there was a scene where the train is being torn apart and pulled off the rails. And the first thing you see is this gorgeous, beautiful African woman, with the whole accoutrement, and it's only because I was just listening to it at the time, right? And it's true, because when I was working for Emery Wars, we have Claudio Sanchez, who's the lead singer and guitarist for Coheed Cambria, and he has a publishing deal, his own book, and he specifically wanted to hire Hispanic people. So he got me to do the art, and he got Emilio Lopez to do the coloring, and he, of course, was doing the writing. Because there is, eventually, someday, we'll see a panel where there's a bunch of Jewish people, Black people, Hispanics, and women. Imagine. Unfortunately, the political community and the voting community, these things are going to be part of it as well, because hate is everywhere. Hate is easy. Greg Rucker wrote in an issue of one woman that I drew, one of my favorite lines ever, where Cassie is having a conversation with Aries, and he asks Cassie, you know what the only thing I like that's food? She goes, what? Love. He goes, no, hate. Because it's the common denominator of everything that is bad. It starts with fear. It starts with hate. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy. And we're the reason why we had to fight it. It's all here. It's all here. Yeah. It's what America's supposed to be. And that's why we keep doing it. Yeah.
But isn't that like
the X-Men.
Yeah.
That from the very beginning.
From the very beginning, yeah.
And that was basically to teach kids.
Yeah.
Not to hate and to realize those are different. And, you can still be friends and not call them fakes.
Well, it was weird because when I was at Marvel, you had Jim Salicrup, who was in the audience, and Danny were Spider-Man, and then you had the Avengers editors, and my office was right next door to Christopher Priest, who was Jim Owsley back then, and Larry Hama. So that office was always like pounding with death metal music and swordplay. I never really knew what Larry and Jim were up to in that office, But so I had the Mute books, and which was Chris Claremont writing like 50 books a month, and it was really important to him.
Yeah.
That it was a diverse community, because Marvel's logo was always the world you see outside your window.
That's right.
But that was not necessarily reflected that well in the comics. If you're talking urban, it was more a reflection of the suburbs, So it was very important to Chris, and he also had two strong female mentors in his life, which I think is what Rags just said about hate. First, there's fear. The building blocks of hate, one of them is fear. And fear is often like with Chris, he had very strong female mentors, his mother and his aunt. So you've got to have that, stop the building blocks of fear, which turns into hate, by starting with mentoring kids when they're very young, not to be afraid and not to. So, anyway.
Yeah. Mark Twain says the surest cure for the prejudice is travel.
Yeah.
It's no people.
And it's startling. You read things like how, only 30% of Americans have passports. And you're just like, what? They're not leaving the country? If you don't leave the country, you are going to become too American, which is like a bad word these days.
I was in Germany, and I found it interesting that it's socially unacceptable to use the word Uber because of the Ubermensch.
Oh,
Because of what Hitler said. And I was just.
You mean Superman?
Huh?
The Superman?
yeah, Ubermensch. Yeah.
Ubermensch. And it's socially unacceptable. So I was at a con, and I was observing a conversation happening. Mostly because I've never seen an African descended person who spoke German. So it was like, okay, check this out. And then she ended the statement she was saying, and she goes on and on, and then she goes, super. And I was just like, so it's true, because they are really trying very hard to distance themselves away from everything. It's not seeing all this crap happening.
Yeah, that's all flying back the other way. I was working on a street art show in Dresden, and there was Mondays is when the neo-Nazi movement was allowed to march. So my hotel in Dresden, a country that was completely bombed at a point when they shouldn't have been bombed because the war was already ending. And they rebuilt the city so that it mirrors everything that was destroyed, which is interesting. They didn't do a different kind of an architecture. And Mondays, you look out your hotel window, and it would be the neo-Nazis marching. They were allowed that one little day that they were allowed to have free speech. So that's how Germany dealt with them.
So I have is it possible for me to ask a question of my fellow panelists? Is this All right, so everyone here has worked as both an editor and a writer and an artist. So are there techniques that you feel free to answer this in any way you want, but when in your editing, your writing, or your art, I mean, you've talked a little about the techniques you use to combat hatred and avoid the default bias that we all experience. So I just wondered if people would want to comment on that, how you creatively respond to it.
Wow. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes the sometimes where you have to combat prejudice is actually on the floor in which you work with colleagues who do not realize they have prejudices. So one of the titles that I edited at DC Comics, and it'll always be a highlight of my career, was Birds of Prey. I really loved Black Canary and Oracle. I loved Barbara Gordon as Oracle, and if this is being shot on camera, the biggest mistake DC made was making Barbara Gordon into Oracle. Like, that's just a fact. Like, what she represented as Oracle was prescient and so much more meaningful. And one time I had some pages and I was walking around, and one of my colleagues who edited, among other things, a female-driven superhero book said to me, well, why is Oracle wearing platform shoes? I was like, what are you talking about? Like, well, like, she can't walk. Why didn't she wear platform shoes? And I just looked at him, and in my mind, I said, you do not have much of an understanding of women. And I just said, you know what? You edit your book, I'll edit mine. Right? And, if you look in Birds of Prey 22, Volume 1, she's wearing a platform shoe. But, this is to say that, prejudice is not always intentional and with malice. And sometimes it comes from people who would consider themselves progressively minded. So I think from an editorial standpoint, the first thing I did was made sure that the representations were to how people wanted to be seen in the world. Whether, they were Black, whether they were women, whether they were disabled, whether they were queer. How would you want to be seen in the world? And talking with people from those backgrounds, as a writer, I would say I just write unafraid. I'm not self-censoring at all. And, with everything that's been happening in our world, there was a legendary writer had posted on Facebook how he did not feel that he could write superhero stories anymore in this time in which we're living. And my feeling is I am thoroughly energized to write superhero stories, to write hero stories, to inoculate, right? To inoculate this diseased system with heroic reflections of people who know what their best qualities are, right? Empathy, for one thing, right? Like, an admiration of intellect for another, and just some basic respect for other people, right? So that would be it. Like, to edit unafraid, to be considerate of these representations of heroes, and to just be more motivated by oppositional ideas.
It's like Captain America. To go back to Captain America, I remember in the 80s I wrote a Captain America story where I had Captain America walk by a newsstand. We're talking because it was pre-internet story. There were still magazines and newsstands. And he saw a bunch of magazines that were about whatever war that America was doing at the time. It would have been the 80s, so I don't even know, like, wherever we were invading. And he got angry and he ripped up the magazine. And the story was kind of about how Captain America represents, like, he doesn't represent America. He represents an ideal. And so, of course, he wasn't into these invasive, because America has this long history from the Banana Republic, from the slaughter of the Native Americans, a long history of America doing terrible things. So Captain America doesn't blindly represent America. And so this was the 80s, and even my editor was a little bit like, I don't know about this story, Captain America, like getting angry at America itself. And then I got all these letters that were literally, get the commie off the book. Literally, like, get the commie off the book, because Captain America expressed an opinion that was, at the time, an anti-American opinion, which was we shouldn't be doing invasive wars in other countries and especially because a lot of the wars were about, deposing like democratically elected leaders, like Guatemala, to name just one, but many others, to put in somebody who was friendlier to their United Banana Company or whatever it was that they were up to. So, like Captain America himself, like that would be the book to write today.
Yeah.
I don't know who's writing it, but boy, would that be a great book to take on today. And have him.
Senator proposal?
No, and have him. And now I'm like, past. Oh, it's a young person should do this. A young person should do this and have him say, "This is not my country." That would be a great story, and it would be a newsworthy story. But would Disney allow it? That's the question. You know.
Well, great coffee for working on Sam Wilson is Captain America.
Great podcast and Narcisse.
Right, sorry.
Yeah.
That. So,
Well, that would
I
be
don't know
great.
what the status of Steve Rogers is right now.
J. Michael Straczynski was writing Captain America recently. He really did go back to Captain America growing up as a boy in the 40s.
Wow.
And dealing with prejudice and dealing with the development of what would become like the Third Reich and the Third Reich mentality in America, and how that, that shaped him. Like the super soldier serum did not make him Captain America. He was Captain America before that, right? He was that guy in his heart, right? The super soldier serum was just a physical manifestation of the unique humanity in Steve Rogers. And I think that's what Straczynski was exploring recently.
You could do the same thing with the Avengers, because the Avengers are like the government superheroes, right? They're like the cops. So what would the Avengers be doing if they were in today's world, watching how the Constitution's being ripped up and how the billionaires have taken over the country to make money out of the country? What would the Avengers do? As a government organization, are they still the government?
I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so.
they were always like who the White House called.
And I don't think they have problems there because then the government tried to turn them into bad guys.
Yes,
And
exactly.
manipulate
Yes.
the papers or whatever.
I mean, that was why I did really love that series, The Boys, because The Boys was like, well, if you're a superhero, you're gonna get arrogant and evil, and it's like Spider-Man's little absolute power, with power comes responsibility.
So,
But the inverse of that is with power, absolute power becomes what? Absolute something terrible.
And they have just been called two that Norman Osborn said that with great power comes great respect. Right? Yes. That are responsibility. Yes.
Yeah, because we're witnessing people who have great power, but they're like evil monsters. So So I mean, the times are right for a comics resurgence if they wanted to be brave. So you're talking like.
I want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. There's a graphic novel. I mean, obviously the graphic novel world. Walking with dreams. But to go back to a guy who starts in the 30s, Will Eisner put out a graphic novel called The Plot, which he literally finished it like the day before he died with the book about the protocols and the elders of Zion.
Yeah.
And Eisner was just so concerned about its resurgence and popularity that.
Can you briefly explain what it is? Just because.
Well, it's the plan that the Jews can take over the world.
Can I say something about the So I just recently went down a little rabbit hole and discovered the protocol of the elders of Zion is this idea that there's a cabal of Jews trying to take over the world. I've known this my whole life. I haven't known when it came from. So it came from.
I did see it at the Juvenile meeting last week. Where were you?
You know what? No, so there was a big pogrom in Kishinev, which was part of Russia, and there were a bunch of Jewish women and some children who were killed and raped, and in the aftermath there was a big surge of world sentiment for Jews, and an official scared of that, wrote the Protocol of the Elders of Zion as a reaction to the sympathy that people were getting in the aftermath of that revolution.
But so it's a completely unreal document that then was taken by anti-Semites and the world of prejudice in general. And
sorry to interject, but just sorry to interject. So that to this day it is prescribed in schools in several countries around the world as fact. Yeah. Just to be clear.
So Eisner, taking the tools at his command, Will Eisner, wrote and drew and did a lot of investigation to the point where this was sort of interesting. I mean, Nick Meyer, who writes a lot of Sherlock Holmes novels and directed Star Trek movies, cites Eisner's The Plot as inspiration for a Sherlock Holmes book he wrote called The Adventures of the Protocol, about Holmes trying to subvert the dissemination of the protocol. But in some comics can be that overt and that artistic. And the world of everything in comics is superhero comics. It's kind of metaphorical, but their whole world. It's the plot is worth checking out just to see what somebody who grew up over 30 in the shadow of Nazism, fascism, and World War II, 50 years later, literally with the sky red, this was what we thought of the 4 days.
And if you want to bring it up to totally contemporary stuff, back in the 80s, there were, I lived in Manhattan, and I used to go to Hell's Kitchen all the time because I was writing Daredevil. Johnny Rabinga and I would walk around the streets of New York, and so me and I forget who the artist was, Steve Lytle, I think, who sadly passed from college. We put a trans character in a Marvel comic back, and no one blinked. Like the editor saw, and then years later, somebody wrote some kind of an essay that said, Marvel has only had one trans person in their entire history. Wow. And so then a Marvel Voices book hired a trans writer, Charlie Jane Sanders, to put another trans, a second trans. So how is the comic industry going to react to the legislation against trans that's going on right now? If comics are brave, they will double down on it. And that's really important because comics have always had this kind of subversive way of tucking social issues, which then, in the whatever it was when I got trolled viciously for being a social justice writer, can you ignore the hate? Because a lot of it is ignore the hate and just keep going.
And can I say one thing, because you're making me realize, so I'm assuming that a lot of you are writers and artists both, and there's the only one problem, which, it's back in the day, if you have one Black character, one woman, one Jewish character, then that character in the world of your story stands for all Jewish people, all women. Yeah. And so it is often better, because I'm interested in technique, to create a smaller story in which no character has to carry the burden of being the only, because then you think, well, I don't want that person to be a pickpocket, because people then going to think that all of the West Side Jewish women are pickpockets. So you want to have a little.
We're that powerful. We can make people think that. That's how powerful.
But we haven't heard from Rags in a while.
I know, yeah.
Yes. About anything you do, they actively, obviously you talked about trying to include people who don't have as much representation.
I would love to hear from you about something you're proud of that you did in this context.
Well, as I said earlier, I did the little person, which I gave large secrets behind it. It's well, you have to go and peel back the layers. Okay, it's not just about what I do as I work. It's also about what I was when I was growing up. And I was born here in that that's my Hamilton, right? when I moved out of there when I was 4 years old, and I was raised in New Jersey. And the names in my neighborhood were Homer, Bon Giovanni, Tecchio, Hergert, Vandal, Mayer. Okay. Not a whole lot of Morales, not a Sanchez in sight. And the only thing that got me over the prejudice that I grew up with was the fact that I was an artist, that I was very good at drawing, and I was also a very good athlete. I always made all-star teams. Those are the only two things that garnered me respect. Until in high school, when I was talking to a friend of mine, and I had a crush on a girl, and he told me it would never work out in Puerto Rico. And I had thought about that because I had been accepted on certain lines. And it was the first, and it kind of shook me a bit, because I had taken things for granted. I had been amongst these people. We played together. We went on teams together. We went to classes together. We did all the kind of activities. So when I realized that I was an outcast, that's when I started saying, no, I'm not accepting this. You can't accept me for my artistic ability, my athleticism, the fact that I'm self-deprecating, have a great sense of humor. Plus, I'm handsome.
And modest.
I didn't want to say that because, but it's just kind of like a product of who you are as a person, and you become as an artist. And then you're going to bring that out. You're going to say, this sucks. I'm really pissed on it. And of course, to watch the news. I don't watch corporate media. I only watch like the free speech TV or something like that. Because I'm sick and tired of being lied to. I was lied to. And what's up?
On that high note, we can keep going for hours. Each one of you is deserving of a panel on this topic by yourself.
I'm not.
What?
I'm not.
No, you are. And she has another panel later today about writing, editing, and writing, and editing, and so on. But I want to open up to the audience. I'm sure people have
I was about to ask, I don't need to be political. I don't need to sound political because, what's been happening right now, full of more hatred, racism, especially towards, Asian communities. Are you guys, trying to, make some comments about, sort of, Asian Americans here, or any plans about making those comments related to what's been going on right now, especially the Asian community, especially when the pandemic came, there was a lot of Asian things in the community.
So I'll say for me that I tend to write about stories that speak to me personally. And then as an editor, I try to reach out to people, and encourage them to write personally. However, my son is now very seriously seeing a young woman who's from China, and her family is from China. And so who knows? It could be that this becomes a more personal story for me. But I always try to aim at the universal through the personal as a writer. And as an editor, I look for people, perhaps young women who might have a story to tell in writing or in drawing. I need that encouragement and some guidance.
Because I think there's this weird thing between, people are always like, authenticity. How can you write about something you're not? But you have to, because otherwise your comics would be populated by just you, or whatever form you're writing in. So there is, but there is sort of I just wrote a Rogue Galactus story, and I love Rogue because I love her sassy, Southern charm with the knife cloaked inside the charm, the whole thing of the velvet glove, but the velvet fist, really. But, I remember thinking, I wish there was an authentic Southern voice writing this comic, because I could fake it and I could call my girlfriend in Georgia and say, would this line work? And she could say, yeah, go for it. But for the most part, it's like there's authenticity, and then there's saying, I'm just going to write all these different people that I am not, in order to have a diverse universe. So those two things are kind of a knife edge, and I remember, because I worked on the Marvel, me and Danny worked on the Marvel, what was it called again?
The Marvel Universe of Superheroes.
Universe of Superheroes. We did a big show. And, a lot of these issues came up while we were building and working on that show. And I'm trying to Ms. Marvel, which was Sana Amanat and G. Willow Wilson, there was so much authenticity in that comic. Like, she meets Lockjaw is his name?
Yep.
What's the name of the dog?
Yeah, Lockjaw.
And she brings the dog into the house, and that violates a Muslim rule, and that became like she had to hide the dog in her bedroom. There's a deep authenticity that could only have come from G. Willow Wilson and Sana.
Right.
And so, to answer your question, you can try. I live next to Chinatown, and so I witnessed a lot of the sort of bad stuff that was going on during the pandemic. And, so there's you as an observer, a non-authentic voice. You could try to bring in a more authentic voice, or at least call someone on the phone, like my friend in Georgia, Edward Road, say yes, but so.
Yeah, so first I want to thank all of you for sharing your stories, because one, it's great to see such a diverse panel, but also the rich history that you all have. I really appreciate it. I guess the question I have for you guys is around the backlash that you see and present today, with show films like the Marvels, and a lot of that is that's backlash against friendly neighborhood Spider-Man that I'm seeing,
right?
And the Captain America movie as well.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what your thoughts are. At first, I'm trying the question, trying to think about it, what you thought about it, what can be done about it. But I wonder what you think that can be done about it from the audience perspective, or as readers, or as consumers, what we can do to sort of support or combat. Because I just feel like these the narrative is being captured from people who are comic book fans, right? Where people are challenging, this isn't the original sort of characters or storyline or whatever, and not really seeing the reason why many of us get into the comic book world, just because we saw something speaking to a part of us that hadn't been spoken to, as a Black queer man or whatever. It's until I read X-Men, until I read some of these stories, I didn't feel like I was represented. So I guess I was asking, what would you say to encourage consumers or fans to deal with this kind of false narrative about them?
Okay, Dad, you want to go first?
I'm just saying, it sounds like that'd be very hard. Movies.
Yeah.
100 years of movies. And what was being represented at that time. And how were the different races being represented during all that time. And this is what people grew up with. The whole lives lesson, to go and then throw in a Black person or a gay person. They're saying, it's like you're shoving it down our throats, but it's because of all those years before. Just seeing basically white people, sometimes rich, or even poor,
and you guys have been doing
or fighting World War II, and Japanese people fighting Americans, which were calling them at the time, and Indians, Native Americans fighting, cowboys, and saying, the Indians are bad.
things like that. It's ingrained.
But but I want to take it further because, part of the promise of the panel is to talk about how comics change. One of the ways that comics have changed is social media. Now, to get directly to your question, when people are attacking fiction, they're not attacking fiction. They're attacking the world. The world is changing. They can't stand it because they're losing their power. So what can they do? Well, the world is too big to hit. I can't hit the world, but I can hit an actor. I can hit a writer of a comic book. I can hit an artist, and I can hit them in back of social media. They don't know my name. They don't know where I live. So I have internet courage. And here's the thing, right? There's this line from Andor, which I'm sure came from someplace. But the line is, oppression is the mask for fear, right? When they inject these toxic statements into social media, that's how we know that we're doing something right. And the answer to what to do about it is intentional action, right? So if they want to spread toxicity, you counter it with positivity. If they want to say this Marvels is not a success, well, then you show a statistic that shows that streaming on Disney Plus, it accomplished this, right? You have to counter toxicity with positivity. Don't retweet it. For God's sake, don't help perpetuate negativity on social media. Perpetuate positive, right? Like, they haven't captured the narrative. That's why they keep doing this every day, because they haven't won. They want to win. And they're losers, and they know it. They know they're wrong, and they know they're losers, and that's why they keep doing it with this kind of tenacity. The goal is to overwhelm. Don't let yourself be overwhelmed. Don't think that their narrative is the narrative. Put out the better narrative as consistently as is comfortable for you and being able to maintain yourself.
Yeah. Today, you got a content on
At the beginning of the panel, Danny, you said something about how a lot of the early missteps were done was been intentioned.
Yeah.
What about Young Allies? That's the one with Whitewash Jones.
Ooh, yeah.
That's not an attack. I'm just wondering if there's a backstory behind that, and
I've not done a great deal of research on Whitewash Jones, but by the name you can tell it was.
Yeah, and he's
a character in Marvel.
Yeah.
It's like everything in the spirit. It's like, and I'm sure other characters, Chalk and the Black. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, to sort of bring on
Rascals, that's a very diverse, hilarious, wonderful. I grew up with the Little Rascals, but in hindsight, you go.
Look, as much as I love the Marx Brothers, the Marx Brothers are the shifty Jew, the crafty Italian, and the retard. That's the Marx. As much as I love the Marx Brothers.
Yeah.
There's something good about that because we've evolved since the Rascals. We've evolved since the Young Allies, and hopefully 50 years from now, people look back at what we do now and say, "Oh, we learned this."
Yes, stereotypes.
Yeah, but I don't think any of that stuff is done with malice and with blindness and with narrowness of vision. So to go back, I don't know, wrap up the question that you had asked. A lot of stuff came across my desk as an editor that I knew the people doing it were not professional diggers. And yet the images they wanted to perpetuate in the comic that I had to sign on by, I couldn't do. And I got it, and one of them is a creator-owned thing. Well, what do you do then? Right. I can't make the guy do this thing. And I'm not going to go out with my name on it. So I made a big thing. And perfectly reasonable people said, "Oh, you're overreacting. You're being too politically correct." But, I'm like, yeah, maybe, but this. And I talked to the artist, and it's like, perfectly nice guy. I'm sure he had friends all across the ethnic and racial spectrum, and this work is, so it's evolving. I think it just is continually evolving.
And it's also about hiring people, like in the 80s at Marvel, Ron Wilson was one of the writers that worked out of my office, and I edited his Super Boxers and his Wolf Pack, and it's just a matter of saying yes. And if you have to put in some extra work to help a young voice emerge, then do it. It's not all, because I was getting plenty of clean scripts from people that I didn't have to work on at all. I just flew through, but so it's a matter of encouraging somebody that has a good idea and helping them work it through. And we really need that in the entertainment business, especially in like the films.
And told you about it.
That's me. Hi, I'm Rajiv Anand. I'm the creator of Laserman, the world's first Indian-American superhero.
Oh, nice.
And the great superheroes were created in the essence of social justice. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man, they all fought through the Great Depression, through the turbulent 60s. They fought these social issues that we're talking about here in this panel discussion. And but now these characters are owned by mega corporations, as we mentioned in the discussion, and the corporations are in service to oligarchs who run our country that are destroying these ideals and social justice messages that the superheroes were created to counteract in the beginning. So what do you think the possibilities of superheroes controlled by these mega corporations to counteract these things in the climate we're seeing?
I mean, it's really tough because a lot of people are just kissing the ring, and you just see that all over the place now, and it's horrifying. And anyone who doesn't kiss the ring, and I hope you know what I'm talking about, has fear. Has a lot of fear. We're living in a time filled with fear because, like, what is that idiot gonna do? Is he gonna, as he defunds the IRS, is he gonna send the IRS to your door? If you don't kiss the ring. So we're being challenged right now, and I think we have to double down.
As you mentioned, this is the greatest time for superheroes. We're not in darkness.
Yes.
When the light shines bright.
Well, there's no shortage of superheroes, and you look at what Marvel is putting out, what DC is putting out. There's never been more of a variety of representation, possibly ever. Like, this change just happened. So the question is, what will comic books from those companies look like in 9 months? Like, I think that's your question. The comic books that are out in the comic shops now, they were made like months ago or a year ago. Like, let's see what happens 9 months later. And I think the second part of the answer is create the heroes, like create the stories, right? If you're depending on Marvel and DC and big corporations to give you the heroes that meet your needs, you're doing yourself a disservice, and that's a losing proposition because, as you said, they're owned by corporations, right? And anything that we get out of progressive about that is either strategic or from the grace of God, or maybe because these companies are so below in the food chain that they can do things that people in ivory towers don't see. But if Superman doesn't meet your needs, create your heroes, write your stories. There's nothing to stop you from getting them out right now. You can make comics, you can put them out on your web. They don't even have to be printed. You can make comics, and you can go to conventions like this, and you can sell reproductions of them. It's like, make the heroes you want. Don't depend.
Exactly. I think that's where the real revolutionary voices are coming from. Not from the corporation, but from
independent comics.
Comic book
100%. 100%. You mentioned Greg Rucka-Rags. He writes a great creator-owned series, which is unfortunately now become a documentary, called Lazarus, with an artist named Michael Lark, which is an examination of what happens when basically 5 elite families run the world. Right? And what's the resistance to that? Because the resistance is always going to come from the nucleus, right, of empire, right? So what's coming, that's going to fight back.
Right. And so maybe the most use that the superheroes can have is inspiration for our own actions. Ask yourself, what was Spider-Man doing?
And I'd like to add too that when we're talking about all this, we're talking about people who only care about money and the power that it gives you. Because the power that it gives you is not money, and the power you think pay or supply. I'm a big proponent of John Fresco. I don't know if you heard of him. He's passed away in 2017. But a self-made genius and has something called the Venus Project. And he feels that that we have the technology now to give the world enough abundance. So we can feed every man, woman, and child on the planet. We can clothe them. You can keep them warm in the wintertime. You can cool them in the summertime. And that the only thing that the sacrifices that would be sacrificed that is elitism. Because if you had a peanut bush and a gaggle of monkeys come along this peanut bush, it's the most maniacal, strongest, and crazy who's going to get to it first. And then he'll get the strongest to back him up. And then he'll get all the females that want some of that peanut bush. And then before you know it, you've got a picture of the top.
And Elon Monkey.
Yeah. Elon monkeys in space. So if you have a bunch of peanut bushers, well then everybody has them and nobody's special. Maybe that's the point you have to really harp on, is that if these guys are gonna go about money, well then guess what? Disney princesses will still be Disney princesses. And they'll still be diverse. And they'll still, because it's making money. So support that ideal. Faith in Valiant is a large woman, a superhero. Yep. Okay, representing people who have large stature. So every queer character, every neurodivergent character, every overweight character, every skinny character, every dark person, everybody who is not part of that elitist mentality of what they should be, they'll still put it out there for you. Because you're the consumer and they want that money. But keep it coming. Don't stop. Say no to that. Yes to this.
Do you feel like there's an appetite to fight back? Do you feel like there's an appetite? Because you see a lot of like media, kissing the ring, and maybe watch the host, you see a lot of supposed legacy trustful sources essentially deciding to distance themselves completely or not speak on some of the First Amendment issues that are coming down the pipe. And they're doing it very quickly. It's been a few weeks. So my question is, you guys spoke about how comic books all the time, me as a reader, talking about it not too long ago, Captain America, and as I got becoming a teenager, the books, I love the fact that, as you guys spoke about earlier, he doesn't represent America, he represents the American dream, right? So as more. So I love that aspect of comic book creation. Do you feel like your peers and you, something's trying to make it now? Is there an appetite to fight back? Or
it's hard to feed a full man.
So yeah.
It's hard to feed a full man.
Yeah.
So if you have people who I haven't had breakfast, I'm surprisingly good. But in another hour or so, I might get really contagious. So yeah, the appetite is there. So it absolutely is.
Do you feel like an appetite for the peers in general? Because this is
I think so. Because we're looking at things.
Yeah, I mean, who do you think our peers? Well, who do you think our peers are? That's a good question. There are more women behind the scenes in comics than ever before. There are more people of color behind the scenes in comics than ever before. At least 52% of the people who are purchasing direct market comics, not all the graphic novels, are women, are girls. So it's like, I think your question answers itself. Like, look at the room you're in, right? Like, we're fighting back. People are fighting back. And if you're using CNN and MSNBC and Fox News to tell you whether people are fighting back. You're looking at the wrong sources.
I'm not saying to say this. I think this group, everyone in this room, has probably put down their phone at some point and read an actual comic, read a book, read something new, read an article that wasn't just on their phone. But we are now a minority. Everyone has been infected by their phones. Yeah. And I used to think the very worst superpower in the world would be telepathy. Can you imagine knowing at all times what everyone in this room was thinking? Someone thinking, I'm about to fart. Am I going to fart? And someone else thinking, my God, is my arm hit snow? I mean, and that is what the internet is. Internet.
Yes.
Phone. I mean, if they catch a fine, take it. Put down your phone.
Yes.
Yeah, pick up a comic book. Not a Marvel comic book, not a DC comic book. Pick up something.
It's a laser man. A laser man.
Yeah,
A laser man.
Laser man.
Laser man's here.
We are shit.
Yeah.
Well, we can't top that. So thank you.
That's a pretty sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, who's gonna do the art?
Can everybody just, because you know what started and you said the name, you sound fast, but I think you like go from right to left and just right.
You can find them all on the website.
Okay, correct.
Yeah.
AllisMcConaughey.com.
Yeah. You can talk to us now.
Search random people. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more comic content. Check out these other videos for even more insight, and I'll see you at the next one. Excelsior.